I'm Dr. Neal Barnard. I'd like to welcome you to the Plant-Based Climate Summit. Today we'll be hearing from experts who will address the impacts of animal agriculture on various aspects of the environment. We'll hear about diet and greenhouse gas emissions, water and air pollution, land use, and the emergence of infectious diseases, and lots more. For me, this is a little bit personal. I grew up in Fargo, North Dakota, and out on the edge of town, if you look out, as far as the eye could see, corn plants, row after row of beautiful, identical, genetically modified corn plants. On this side of the highway, it was soy. As far as the eye could see, beautiful, all the plants were identical because they were genetically modified too. No human being was going to eat any of that soy or any of that corn. That's cattle feed, chicken feed, hog feed. Now, to raise that many plants for animal feed, you have to have fertilizer, you need irrigation, you need pesticides. And as that irrigation carries the fertilizer into the streams and rivers, the algae will overgrow and eventually die off. And as it flushes down the Mississippi below Louisiana and Texas, there is now a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico as big as the state of New Jersey. All to try to raise a huge number of plants to get a little bit of meat out of it. And then we learned something else. Cows on dairy farms, on meat farms, belch methane and cause all kinds of problems that in turn can affect the environment for everybody. Well, today we're going to tackle all of those problems and a lot more, and most importantly, we're going to learn what we can do about it. Let's go to Dr. Leslie Duram, who is a professor of geography and environmental resources, Fulbright Scholar, and director of the Environmental Studies program at Southern Illinois University. Dr. Duram is also a Food for Life instructor who is passionate about educating others about food choices that have a positive impact on people and the earth.
Hi, I am Leslie Duram. I'm a professor of geography and environmental studies at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. I know you see the word professor and you're worried about a really boring, dry lecture, but no, this is going to be exciting. You're going to learn a lot, but we have a lot to cover. We're going to talk about Climate Change 101, plant-based eating for individual action. So the Earth's climate system is fascinating. It is truly amazing, right? So our climate stability requires equal amounts of energy entering and leaving the system. So for us to think about our near surface temperatures, those are dependent on two factors: solar energy or light reaching the surface of the Earth and terrestrial energy or heat leaving the system. Both of these are impacted by both natural forces and human or anthropogenic factors. The climate system is this super cool, complex system of 5 different parts: the atmosphere, ice or all frozen water on the planet, the hydrosphere, land surfaces, and vegetation. And they all act together, but they also interact with one another. It's really amazing. The greenhouse effect is good. We need it. We like it. It's a good thing. People often kind of get confused about, oh, well, global warming, the greenhouse. No. So in a normal situation with normal carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxides, those are the greenhouse gases. With a normal setting, the greenhouse effect is great because it allows a certain amount of solar radiation in, it traps some to keep us nice and warm like a little blanket, and then it lets some heat escape. That's great. As opposed to Venus, our neighbor closer to the sun, it has too much of a blanket, too thick of an atmosphere with different substances, different gases. So it's too hot. Mars doesn't have enough of that blanket, so it's too cold. So the Earth is just right. The problem is that humans are causing an intensified greenhouse effect, and that means global warming and climate change. So basically these greenhouse gases, which are supposed to absorb and emit energy, they have increased too much. There's too much of these carbon dioxide, nitrous oxides, and methane in the atmosphere. It's really amazing because these gases only make up like 0.0% of the whole atmosphere. Mostly it's nitrogen, oxygen, and argon. But just that 0.04% is such a delicate system, we've really messed it up. So we're trapping more heat than we should be. We have really good data on this. So this is historical CO2 concentrations. If you look at the chart, the bottom line, that's years before present. And we have data through ice cores and other means that go back 10,000 years. And you can see the purple line there kind of going into the blue line. There's a little variation, but not much. But then when you get to the current era, 1800 on, especially 1880, and then that red line, that's actually about 1950 on. We've pulled that out to stretch that 1800 to 2000 in that little offset box. You can see this rapid increase, this huge sudden increase really in CO2 emissions. And this is post-industrialization, post-industrial food system, etc. So a lot of climate deniers like to say, oh, it's just a natural process. The earth warms and cools and that's natural. And climate scientists would say, no. Because we have really good data looking backwards. So this is actual data. This isn't pretend. This isn't assumptions. This isn't, oh, what if? This is real data. So we have real data. The bottom chart there, if you look at the natural variability. So if a volcano goes off, we have more particulate matter in the air, so it would cool global temperatures. Solar flares, deniers like to talk, oh, it's solar flares. Well, that's the little red line there along on that chart. So natural variability does not explain how the Earth's temperatures have changed from 1880 to 2020, okay? You have to consider the human-caused factors that are affecting global temperature. That's that light blue line. And what do you know when you actually look then at the observed global warming? That's the red line on top, that chart. Those are actual observed global warming temperatures. Those can only be explained when we include human-caused factors that affect temperature. So CO2, methane, nitrous oxides, greenhouse gas emissions. So climate modeling is amazing. It's really, really complex. Climatologists like to do things like general circulation models. This is an example of one here, a three-dimensional numerical model of the whole climate system. Now let's think about that. First, we have our beautiful whole planet, but then what do? Well, we need to think deep down in the ocean, on up to the mixed layer, ocean and air, on over to the continent, up into the mountains, up into the atmosphere. So we're talking about height, right? So latitude. So not only the grids of latitude and longitude, are you near the equator, or are you near the pole, but also all these levels of from the ocean depths to the mountain tops. Think about all that data. It's really pretty cool. And scientists are really good at this. And in fact, now I'm showing you how we can model forward. So these are modeling scenarios based on human action. What are we going to do? Projected temperature change by 2090 if CO2, so if carbon dioxide emissions drop to 0 by 2080. So if we start taking action right now to stop our greenhouse gas emissions and we get it down to 0 by 2080, you can see the temperature there, that we could keep it within 2 to 3 degrees of warming. That is maybe manageable in terms of in terms of adaptation, in terms of what we can do to survive that. But if you look at the bottom scenario, that's when CO2 emissions triple, which is sort of like our current path. If we don't do anything, if we just continue, then you see we're way up into those purples and pinks, which is something like 9 or 10 degrees Fahrenheit increase. And that would, to be honest, be devastating. So when we look at this in another way, you can see 1950 to 2000, that's the gray line. Those are what we know about temperatures, and then we can project it forward. So if we take action, we're smart, humans start slowing or stopping our greenhouse gas emissions. We could be in that purple phase. There's still going to be warming just because we've set this path. We've already got the greenhouse gases, those extra gases up there, but at least we could level out by 2100. But if we continue along our current path, that's the scenario 39, if you will, that red line does not look good, right? That's a 4 degree Celsius increase by the turn of the century. You may have noticed I used a lot of IPCC data and charts here. It's all free, readily available. I encourage you to go to IPCC, to their website. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was established in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Program. IPCC actually won a Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. Very important group. So this UN group has over 195 member countries, basically almost every country in the world is a member. And these IPCC expert reports then are used by each country to develop their own climate policies. So thousands of scientists and experts assess the science of climate change and come up with these reports. They summarize thousands of research papers. They look at the drivers, what's causing climate change, the impacts, the risks to people, animals, plants, places, the mitigation, so what can we do to stop this? The adaptation, what can we do to live with it if this happens? This is an open review process. Objective reports are published. I highly recommend looking at some of the IPCC documents. Here's just an example. I was joking the other day, there are probably thousands of various charts, but I just pulled these because I thought they were kind of a neat example. So this is from one of the IPCC reports from 2013. And the top graph there shows land surface air temperature. So that's pulling from 4 different data sets. So maybe there's a European Union data set, a Chinese data set, an Australian, whatever. Various researchers doing various projects. You could see still, even with 4 different data sets, those temperatures line up pretty closely. So this is 2050 to 2010, and you're looking at land surface temperature there on the top. The middle chart is actually 6 data sets looking at sea level rise, and the bottom chart is summer Arctic sea ice, again looking with 7 data sets. So see, this IPCC is able to just pull all of this data from each national or you know, what every country's experts to look at these factors. And the IPCC said, well, you know, how do we know, people? How do we know? Evidence for a warming world comes from multiple independent climate indicators, from high up in the atmosphere to the depths of the oceans. And I just thought this schematic was so cool. So, okay, how do we know? Well, big down arrows. So glacier volume is going down. Snow cover is going down. Our measurements of sea ice area going down. But all the others are going up. So air temperature, sea surface temperature, sea levels are rising, overland temperatures, etc. So we have data points all across the planet, and we have experts looking at this, and they're telling us what's going on. So the IPCC likes to publish these statements in each of their reports, and I just pulled a few of these that I think are really relevant for our discussion today. First, warming of the climate system is unequivocal. And since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. Secondly, the atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide have increased to levels unprecedented in at least the last 800,000 years. Those are both pretty strong statements. I have a little asterisk there because I want to now talk about carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxides related to food. So a quarter-pound burger takes 460 gallons of water to produce. It uses almost 65 square feet of land. So just a quarter pound, that little, a lot of people eat bigger than that. But in any case, it not only takes, but it gives back things that we don't want. So a lot of methane is 23 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So it's really, it doesn't stay and last in the atmosphere as long, but it's extremely potent as a greenhouse gas. So when we talk about that quarter pound of burger, we kind of say that it causes 4 pounds of greenhouse gas emissions. These are often given as CO2e or CO2 equivalent. So basically that is one number that's combining the carbon dioxide, which is the fossil fuel inputs, the methane, CH4, which is from manure and ruminant animals, and the nitrous oxides from the fertilizer and manure. We're kind of putting all of those greenhouse gases together and giving it as a CO2 equivalent. And you can see one chart there projecting scary, right, into the future of 2050 with increased growth, but I like to think people will be smarter than this. But still looking at 2005, you can see the red meat, poultry, eggs, dairy. If we could just get rid of all those from the light blue down and just focus on the staples, fruits, and veg, we would be a lot better off in terms of our carbon footprint, our CO2e. And going back to the IPCC, we see that in a recent report, they also talk about the importance of diet and our planet. Avoiding meat and dairy is the single biggest way to reduce your impact on Earth. Meat and dairy provide just 18% of calories and 37% of protein, but take up 83% of our farmland. And impacts of the lowest impact dairy products typically exceed those of vegetable substitutes, providing new evidence for the importance of dietary change. And this is from 2019. Fun fact, so the top right there, if cattle were a country, they would rank third in greenhouse gas emissions, right behind China and very close to the United States. On the left there, the little car, if for 1 year, every person in the US ate no meat or cheese for just 1 day a week, it would be like taking 7.6 million cars off the road. Well, let's just do it for 7 days a week. And then finally, the bottom graph there is about methane emissions. One cow produces about as much methane as 80 cars on the road. So how is this happening? Why is this happening? Well, because we have an agricultural industrial system. And so in industry, the goal is profits for the shareholders, the cheapest inputs with the highest outputs, inputs like fossil fuels, genetically modified seeds, fertilizers, etc. And we're doing this by using concentrated animal feeding operations. CAFOs are defined by the EPA as over 1,000 head of cattle, 2,500 swine, or 125,000 chickens concentrated in one operation. There are about 20,000 in the US, but to be honest, there's no set number. You should try and search this online because there is no really comprehensive database about how many and where these are located. We do know they use about 80% of antibiotics in the US. And I want you to think about how in this scenario, the environment is just another input. It's like fossil fuels. It's like insecticides. Now let's think a little bit about the ethics of this agricultural system. So first of all, we're slaughtering billions of land animals each year. That's an ethical issue for sure. Secondly, only 55% of calories produced globally actually go to food for people. The remainder go to food for biofuel and livestock. This is a very inefficient system, and that is unethical. So the conversion efficiencies, we talk about this in agriculture, right? Calories of feed in to food produced. Dairy is 17% efficiency, eggs 17%, poultry 13%, pork 9%. Beef is only 3% efficient. All the feed going in, you get 3% of food produced in terms of calories. If we grew food crops for direct human consumption, we could increase food calories by 70% and feed 4 billion more people. And here's a map that shows this. It would be easier to feed the planet if more of the crops we grew ended up in human stomachs. So on this graph, on this map, the green is actual food for people. That's where food for people is being grown. And the purple is food for livestock, basically, right? Food for animals and fuel. And as we all know, there's terrible undernourishment and across the planet, something like 823 million people are estimated to be chronically undernourished. This was from 2020. So people need to know this, right? This just seems so obvious. Agriculture is a huge component of our greenhouse gas emissions. There are a lot of different estimates because it depends on, people do this real narrow view. Oh, I'm just going to look at the amount of energy it costs to take the cow to the market. Well, no, you need to think about the crops, the fertilizer, the agrochemicals, gasoline, the machinery, transportation, feedlots, slaughter, refrigeration, marketing. And when you look at it that way, agriculture is 25 to 30% of all human caused or anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And meat and dairy is especially high in greenhouse gas emissions. Why don't we label it? Why don't we have like a food, like, you know, the usual nutrition label and then a carbon facts label? Here's a cheeseburger. It doesn't look good. The carbon to product ratio is terrible, right? But people need to know this. People need to know, if you look at the infographic here on the right, we can drastically change the way we use cropland. If we just replace beef with plants in the US, we could reduce our amount of cropland by 90% going to the, you know, because we're just feeding livestock. We could reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We could reduce our nitrogen fertilizer use, which also adds into greenhouse gas emissions. Well, luckily there is increasing interest and increasing research on this. And this was an article a few years ago in The Economist. Check out that graph, pretty interesting. And they say, quote, absolute veganism, unsurprisingly, is the most environmentally friendly diet. Die-hard leaf eaters can claim to have knocked off 85% off their carbon footprint. And you can see the average American diet there, over 2,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per person per year. And down at the very bottom is the vegan. And some would argue we could also do away with the sugars and oils. That would make it like, what, maybe 200 or 250 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per year. Let's bring this back. Don't forget the main theme here is climate change. And so if we look at the trends, we absolutely see that we are getting increasingly warmer and warmer. So that zero line, if you think of the main line going across there, that's the average temperature from 1951 to 1980. That's the line. When you see the blue below, those were years that were cooler average temperatures. And then when you see the yellows and the oranges and the reds, those are the years that are higher, warmer than that mean, warmer than that average. This is data from over 6,000 meteorological stations on land, at sea, in the Arctic. And you need to know that Earth's temperature has risen more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the 1880s. And here's a quote from one of the lead researchers. The last 7 years have been the warmest 7 on record, typifying the ongoing dramatic warming trend. But he says we have to expect that these records will continue to be broken. How have we been handling that? Create incentives for a non-meat diet. How about tax credits for eating healthy? Subsidies for bean and veggie producers? That makes perfect sense from a societal point of view. We aren't doing that yet, but we should. So instead, we have to take personal action. And one key way to do this is to choose a plant-based diet. 1 calorie of animal protein requires 11 times as much fossil fuel energy input as 1 calorie of plant protein. We can mitigate climate change by choosing a plant-based diet. Of course, the PCRM knows this, and we talk about the power plate all the time: fruit, grains, veggies, and legumes. And I would also argue that we could think of the power plate as better for the people and better for the planet. Thanks so much for your time.
Next, we'll hear about how foods can help heal our bodies and the world. From Ocean Robbins, who's the co-founder and CEO of the Food Revolution Network. He's the best-selling author of 31-Day Food Revolution and has reached millions of people all over the world.
My name is Ocean Robbins. I am CEO and co-founder of Food Revolution Network. I'm an author and a speaker and a lifelong activist. And I am so grateful that you are here right now, because we are talking about one of the most important topics that there is to talk about: the survival of life on Earth, human well-being, how we live in a good way on this planet, how we can thrive. We live in a toxic food culture. All around us, we see a food system that has normalized consumption of food products and food-like products that are statistically correlated in a profound way with increased risk of heart disease and cancer and type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's and obesity and all of the major chronic ailments of our times. But they don't just affect us. The food choices that we have adopted in the modern industrialized world are also a disaster for our planet. Animal agriculture in specific uses 83% of the world's agricultural land to produce 18% of the world's calories. It's like a protein factory in reverse. And it makes sense if you think about it. When you go up the food chain, you concentrate, but you also have tremendous latency in the system. You have loss because animals don't just turn what they eat into flesh or milk or eggs. They also turn it into hoof and hide and bones and feathers and fecal material and energy and body heat and all kinds of other things that do not contribute to the food chain. So there's a tremendous loss in that process. It takes about 12 pounds of grain or soy to produce 1 pound of feedlot beef in the United States today. It takes 3 to 5 pounds of feed to produce a pound of chicken or pork. So essentially, we're wasting all the rest. And when livestock are grazing, it's arguably even more inefficient because it takes so much land to produce enough grass to feed a cow. And then that gets concentrated into flesh, and we wind up with this enormous amount of waste. So if just theoretically, the entire world went vegan tomorrow, which I know may not happen, but let's just play with me here for a second. If that just were to happen, we would free up an area of land that is equal to the entirety of the United States, China, the European Union, and Australia combined. That's how much land would be saved by simply not cycling calories through livestock. What could we do with an area of land equal to the US, China, European Union, and Australia combined? Well, we could plant forest. We could grow organic food to feed a growing human population for future generations. We could focus on the science of carbon sequestration so that we could plant crops in ways that would pull carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil and help to save our planet. The modern industrialized food system has become a nightmare, not just for the animals who are tortured in these factory farms that we've created, but also for ecosystems, for all of the wild creatures whose survival depends on their ecosystem. And now today, their forests are being chopped down, burned, devastated, so that we can create enough land to feed our voracious appetite for meat. The tropical rainforests are falling to create grazing land for cattle and to create agricultural land on which we grow what? Corn and soy. Who's eating most of the corn and soy? It's not going to tofu. It's not going to, tortillas. It's going to livestock feed. And we subsidize it. In the United States, we have a system we call the Farm Bill. And we subsidize certain foods. And it's great that we support our farmers. Our farmers deserve support. They work hard and they deserve to be supported. But here's the problem. We're subsidizing certain things and not other things. And so we have tens of billions of dollars a year in subsidies that go towards essentially corn and soy and wheat and other so-called commodities crops. And in effect, we are driving down the price of factory farmed animal products, high fructose corn syrup, and white bread. Meanwhile, competitively in the marketplace, because we're not subsidizing fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds and legumes and the things we should be eating more of, we create a competitive disadvantage for healthy foods. This essentially, in effect, condemns the poor to nutritional disasters. So what can we do about it? A lot, and that's the good news. We can change the way we eat. So we choose to focus on more plant-based food choices. And when we do, we can save massive amounts of land, water, ecosystems, climate impact with that one simple action. Every bite you take is a vote. You're voting for the health you want, and you're voting for the world you want. And so let's make that a conscious, healthy vote that stands for the world that our children deserve. And we can also change policies. We can stop subsidizing junk food effectively. Now let's talk about the money side for a second. The United States has the most expensive healthcare or disease symptom management system in the world. We spend about 19% of our gross domestic product of the entire nation on medical treatment. The vast majority of that medical treatment is going to treat chronic diseases, which could be prevented with healthier diet and lifestyle. So we're talking trillions of dollars here that could be saved, and a whole lot of lives. In the United States alone, every year, we lose more than 600,000 Americans who die because of chronic diseases that could be prevented with healthier diet and lifestyle. I'm not just making this up. This comes from the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation. They produced the Global Burden of Disease report. This is hundreds of scientists come together to create this report from all over the world. They're looking at what's causing death and disease all over the world. And that's their conclusion. 672,000 American deaths a year from lifestyle-induced chronic illness. So that's more Americans that are dying from that every year than died in World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, both Iraq wars, the Afghanistan war, the Korean War combined. And it's all in 1 year, every year. But the enemy isn't guns or bombs. It's our own knives and forks and what we're doing with them. So the good news is we can turn this around. We can help to save our economy. We can help to save our lives, and we can help to save our planet. I'd call that a win-win. And I want to share a little bit about myself here, just to get a little bit of context here for where I'm coming from in this story. My grandpa founded an ice cream company. It was called Baskin-Robbins, 31 flavors. And my dad, John, grew up with an ice cream cone-shaped swimming pool in the backyard and 31 flavors of ice cream in the freezer. He was groomed from early childhood to one day joy in running the family company. But when he was in his early 20s, he was offered that chance and he said no. And he walked away from a path that was practically paved with gold and ice cream to follow his own rocky road. He ended up moving with my mom to a little island off the coast of Canada. They grew most of their own food. They practiced yoga and meditation for several hours a day, and they named their kid Ocean. They almost named me Kale, and this was before Kale was cool, but thankfully, on behalf of my future social life, they took the more conservative route when they named their son. But we did eat a lot of kale and cabbage and carrots and other veggies from the garden. And as I got older, we moved to California, and my dad ended up working on a book called Diet for a New America that exposed the food industry and looked at how our food choices impact our health, our happiness, and the future of life on Earth. It became this runaway bestseller. People all over the world were super inspired. The media called him the rebel without a cone. And one of his readers ended up being my grandpa, Irvin Robbins, who was practically on death's door. He'd lost his brother-in-law, Bert Baskin, his business partner, to heart disease when my dad's uncle, Bert, was 54 years old. Now, my grandpa, at around age 70, was practically on death's door with serious diabetes, heart issues, and weight issues. His doctors told him he should read my dad's book and follow its advice if he wanted to live. My grandpa did. He ended up giving up sugar, giving up ice cream, cutting way down on animal products and eating way more whole fruits and vegetables. And he got results, like massive results. He reversed his diabetes. He reversed his heart disease. He lost 30 pounds he needed to lose. His golf game improved 7 strokes, and he lived 19 more healthy years. So we've really seen in our family that when we follow the standard American diet, we get the standard American diseases. So now we're calling for a food 3.0, which is governed by health for our bodies and health for our planet. And there's plenty of healthy profits in food 3.0. It's just that they come from healthy food. So what are you going to do? Are you going to be part of the food revolution with us? I hope you will. Every bite you take, every dollar you spend is a vote. It's a stand, and it sends out ripples that impact the entire planet. It affects how animals are treated, how farm workers are treated, what kind of world we're going to leave for future generations. When you bring your food choices into alignment with your core values, your life takes on an integrity, a congruency, a potency that moves the world. So I thank you for your time and your attention, your interest, your participation, and for all the steps you take to be a part of the food revolution in your life and on our planet.
Now we'll hear from Jenné Claiborne, who you may know from Sweet Potato Soul, her popular blog, cookbook, and YouTube channel about tips and tricks to make your diet more sustainable.
Hi, I'm Jenné Claiborne from Sweet Potato Soul. I'm a vegan chef, a blogger, and a cookbook author. I know a lot about vegan cooking, and I happen to be very frugal and very eco-conscious minded. So I'm going to give you guys some tips today for maintaining your plant-based diet, but also helping to be more eco-friendly, help to save the environment, and of course, save money, because all these things happen to be tied in with each other. I found that going vegan was amazing in so many ways, not just for my health and for the animals, but also the environmental component as well, and just the mindset component. Being vegan has helped me to think more about all of the actions that I take in my daily life, especially when it comes to my consumption habits Am I wasting food? Am I buying too much? Oops, is this food going bad because I'm not storing it well? So we're going to talk about all of my tips to make sure that you eat in a more eco-friendly way. That's also good for your health, good for the animals, and also good for your budget, because who doesn't want to save a little bit of money? So just specifically focusing on the perishable items, how do you make sure that they last longer and don't go bad? So let's talk about that. My first tip for making your produce last longer is storing it properly, of course, but more specifically, when it comes to herbs, and you can even use this tip for greens like kale, spinach, collard greens, I like to store, especially my herbs, in a jar of water in the refrigerator. And to make sure that that doesn't dry out and it stays nice and fresh and perky, I cover the jar or the herbs with a plastic bag. Now, just a recycled plastic bag is fine. A little Ziploc bag is fine. I don't go out and buy plastic bags, but we all end up with plastic bags. So save your plastic bags. I also, if anybody buys Ezekiel bread, they come in a plastic bag. I even save them to reuse for this purpose. So herbs in the jar, just like you would a bouquet of flowers, and you cover that with a recycled plastic bag. It will make your herbs last so much longer, to the point where you can actually eat all of the herbs and they're not going to go bad at all. My second tip for making your produce last longer is making sure that you're storing it in the right drawers inside of your fridge. So you have a high humidity drawer and a low humidity drawer. Now, it really does matter what you put into each drawer. For example, I like to think of it as the vegetables that will wilt. So leafy greens like spinach, anything that's going to wilt, that should be in the high humidity drawer. Anything hard can go in the low humidity drawer. So carrots and beets do perfectly fine in that. Just make sure that you are thinking about this when you're putting your groceries away when you get home from the grocery store or the farmer's market, because that will really help them last for longer. So my next tip is to not store potatoes and onions together. The gases that the onions give off, or is it the potatoes? Basically, together, they do not mix well. They will help each other ripen too quickly, and you can't enjoy them if they've gone bad before you've even had a chance to eat them. So store them separately. They both like to be stored in cool, dark, dry places, but just not together. So this tip is super important, especially if you like to meal prep like I do. Sometimes when I get home from the store, I like to wash my greens, especially my kale, collard greens, anything I'm going to use for salads, so arugula and lettuce. I like to wash it right away. That way, when I make my salad or when I use it throughout the week, I don't have to wash it. Once you've washed your vegetables, you'll find that it will go bad more quickly. Same with fruit. So my usual tip would be to don't wash anything until you're ready to eat it, because vegetables and fruit are covered with good bacteria and fungus that actually help it stay fresh for longer. So when you wash that protective layer off, it goes bad more quickly. But if you're like me and you need to meal prep, you need to prep all your greens, then in order to keep them fresh for longer, wash them, store them in an airtight container. So whatever glass, plastic, whatever container you have. But here's the tip. You need to put a paper towel or even just a kitchen towel, small kitchen towel, dry, stick it in the bag or the container with those washed greens, the washed vegetables. That way, when your lettuce or the greens, when they basically sweat and release moisture, instead of sitting in their moisture and going bad more quickly, the paper towel or the kitchen towel is going to absorb the excess moisture and keep them fresher for longer. And then my last tip for keeping your vegetables fresher for longer, this is another like meal preppy kind of tip. So if you want to not only wash your vegetables before you use them, but actually prep them, chop them up and have them ready to go, especially, if you want to have them for snacks like celery, carrots, even apples, you can do this with. Cut them up and store them in a jar or container and cover that with water. Everything should be covered with water. Water is going to prevent those vegetables from spoiling quickly, from oxidizing, and it's going to keep them nice and crispy and fresh. Cover it with water. You know, if you're going to leave it for a long time, like an entire week, you might have to change the water out once in between. But otherwise, if you're just keeping it like that for a couple of days while you're snacking on the carrots or celery, then that is perfectly fine. And trust me, it will work. It will keep your vegetables so crispy and so fresh. My next one is to plan out your meals and be organized and have a plan and have a list, really, when you go grocery shopping or to the farmer's market. Having a list and having your meals planned out ahead of time will help you to buy exactly how much you need so that you will avoid coming home with way more food than you can use. I am guilty of this too often, even though this is my tip and I know better. I love going to the farmer's market or the grocery store and just looking at all of the produce, and especially the farmer's market, because there's it seems like every time I go, there's something that I've never seen before and I'm interested in it and I might buy it, but I have no place for that on my grocery list or my meal prep for the week. And so it ends up like almost going bad and I cook at the last minute. So don't be like me. My last major tip, really, but this is important, is to actually use up your scraps as much as possible. There's so many things we think of as scraps, as food waste that we actually throw out, but that is so nutritious and so delicious too. So we really shouldn't be throwing it out. We're very much throwing out good food when we do this. So I have a list of things that I just want to remind you can eat. And if you've never heard of eating something like carrot tops, then there are plenty of recipes on the internet for these things and to utilize them. And like I said before, the food scraps, a lot of the things that we think of as being trash are perfectly good food, and they're just as nutritious as the rest of the vegetable or fruit that we ate. So the first thing I wanted to start with was broccoli stems. Same with cauliflower stems. They are totally edible. Now, they're not as delicious, of course, than the florets, but you can eat them. And my favorite way to eat broccoli stems or cauliflower stems is to just chop them up with the florets and steam them or bake them or roast them just like I would with the rest. It's really, for me, changing my mindset around it. Like, it's growing up, I always would like just eat the top of the broccoli and waste the bottom. But I've been reminding myself over the years that no, this is the whole food. I'm going to eat the entire thing, not just the top. And I just use it in the same way that I would use the rest of it. But if you have a recipe like cauliflower kung pao chicken, then maybe you really just want to use the top. So with the stalks or the stems, you can grate those up, shred them up, and use them in a coleslaw, a vegan coleslaw, or you can saute them. You don't have to shred it by hand. You can use the food processor, because if you're like me and you don't want to be on that box grater for like 15 minutes, stick it in the food processor, let it shred it up, and then put it to use. It's really yummy. My other favorite thing to make sure I do not throw out, I never throw it out, are mushroom stems. I like to turn it into a delicious mushroom broth. When it comes to the tops of root vegetables, you know you can eat those, right? You can. They're delicious. Carrot tops, sweet potato greens, not regular potatoes. Those are toxic. Their leaves are toxic. But sweet potato leaves, the tops, are very nutritious and delicious. Carrot tops, delicious, nutritious. Beet greens, amazing. Turnip tops, those should be eaten as well. If you ever buy beets and you throw away the leaves on top, you just threw away 50% of the food that you bought. Fruit waste. It's not waste. For example, apple and pear cores. Those can be reused, believe it or not. I don't do this all the time. Most of the time I do just compost the core. I just make sure to eat as much as I can around it. But if I want to upcycle it, I love to make a simple, not a simple syrup, but a syrup with the core. So you basically boil the apple core or the pear core or both together, Boil that with some sugar and a little bit of water. You put vanilla bean in there. You can put cardamom, cinnamon, whatever else you want in there, and reduce that down to an amazing syrup, which you strain out. And you can use that for pancakes, waffles, biscuits, any way you would use maple syrup. But this is a syrup that is imparted with the flavor and essence and goodness of apples. It's so yummy. I also have a tip for upcycling orange peels and lemon peels as well. So with the peels, I like to save them. And once I have usually about 2 to 3 to even 4 cups, depending on the size of my container, I will put them in a large container and cover that with just simple white vinegar. Let that sit for 6 weeks in just a cool, dark place. Just forget about it for 6 weeks. And then you come back to it, you can strain it out, and you'll be left with a cleaning product that is orange scented with all the power of vinegar, of white vinegar for cleaning. So it makes your white vinegar a lot more pleasant for cleaning. And I use that for cleaning anything from the kitchen to the bathroom to the floors. It smells great, and it is a wonderful way to reuse orange peels. Pineapple core. So what I like to do is just chop it up and stick it in a smoothie. It's easy as that. And then lastly, avocado pits. If you boil them down, they make a beautiful pink dye. So you can dye anything with it. It's a dye, D-Y-E. So you can put them in a smoothie, you can blend them up. You have to use a high-speed blender for this, or you can break them, you can cut them into little tiny pieces and eat them that way. But they totally are edible and very, very nutritious as well. So those are my tips for being more eco-friendly with your vegan diet. I've been vegan for 10 years and I'm constantly learning, and everybody is constantly learning. It's very important to just stay in that mindset of, we don't know everything, and we're continuing to learn and grow and share what you've learned with your friends and family, because when people come on board, then it makes it easier for all of us to do it as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Like I said, my name is Jenné Claiborne. My blog is Sweet Potato Soul. My cookbook is also called Sweet Potato Soul. I'm Sweet Potato Soul anywhere. So if you want to find me, type in Sweet Potato Soul. I hope that was helpful. Thanks so much. Bye.
Now we'll hear from Dr. Joanne Kong, who's a faculty member at the University of Richmond, and as an author, international speaker, and musician, she raises our awareness that our food choices have deep connections to the natural world and our sense of compassion.
This past year has certainly been a difficult and challenging one in dealing with the global health crisis and the resulting drastic changes to our daily lives. But at the same time, the coronavirus has brought us to an important point in humankind's development, a point of evolution, if you will, with both the necessity and the opportunity to widen our paths to better health and a more sustainable planet. What have we learned? That our existence is deeply tied to the nature of our relationships to all other beings. The coronavirus is a clear warning shot that humans must move away from animal exploitation. At least 75% of emerging infectious diseases can be traced to animals. As Dr. Michael Greger says, every animal in a factory farm is like a test tube that can brew up the next plague. So it would be a mistake to think we can all return to normal as if COVID-19 was just a one-time occurrence. It's a sign that we must question our current food systems, for animal agriculture has reached its point of greatest damage both to global health and our planet. While the impacts of the virus are assessed in concrete numbers of those infected and lives lost, it's more difficult to objectively see in the immediacy of our daily lives the devastation to the environment and the rising threat of climate change, both of which have root causes in the commodification of animals as a food source. Humans tend to perceive environmental impacts as slow-moving and less tangible, like a long-term problem that can be put off. But we're learning that in order to come out of the present crisis and ensure our survivability and that of future generations, we'll have to make a clear paradigm shift in the ways we conduct our lives and how we view our place in the world. This means pursuing proactive, preventive courses of action through restoring and regenerating our precious resources and nourishing ourselves with healthy, plant-sourced whole foods that strengthen our immune systems and prevent disease. The health of our bodies and of the earth are one and the same. As Inger Anderson, Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program, says, nature is sending us a message with the coronavirus pandemic. Failing to take care of the planet means not taking care of ourselves. And yes, the actions society needs to take are large transformative ones, transitioning to food practices that prioritize healthy diets on a global scale, redirecting economic resources to scale up the production of plant foods, improving agricultural practices, putting an end to massive deforestation and the decimation of our oceans, reducing food waste and world hunger, addressing issues of food justice, supporting the development of new food technologies, and many others. We need greenhouses instead of slaughterhouses. In the midst of these challenges, it can seem that we are powerless, as if there is little we can do as individuals to make a difference. But nothing could be further from the truth. Moving in the direction of and adopting a greener, plant-based lifestyle is the single most powerful thing you can do for yourself and the earth. And it's something you can do right now. Did you know by going vegan, you'll not only improve your health, but cut your carbon footprint in half? Vegans each use 1/18 of the land resources used by a typical meat consumer, and in 1 month can save over 30,000 gallons of water, 1,000 pounds of grain, and 900 square feet of forest. You have tremendous power as a consumer. Just look at the exploding market of plant-based foods and cruelty-free products in just the past 5 years. While adopting a plant-sourced lifestyle is beneficial to our physical existence, it's so much more. Its significance goes deeper to our sense of identity. It's about this defining question: do we see ourselves in all others? In looking over the past year, mainstream media and public awareness, rightly so, have centered on how we move beyond the virus, focusing on those who are ill, ramping up our vaccination efforts, and working towards economic recovery. Yet, despite evidence pointing to an animal wet market as a possible origin of the pandemic, society as a whole continues to hold an enormous blind spot, a numbness to the mass violence and death committed against our kindred non-human animals every second of every day. Last spring, millions of animals were killed as supply chains were disrupted, yet the industry remained disconnected from this cruel reality, refusing to acknowledge what it is, instead calling it euthanasia, culling, or depopulation. Ultimately, veganism is about healing our world. It's about cultivating a greater sense of oneness with nature, seeing ourselves in others, and widening our capabilities of love, sensitivity, and kindness in order to lessen suffering. It's about reawakening our greatest gifts, our innate compassion, and connecting with sentient beings all equally capable of feeling and suffering. Going plant-based elevates us to a higher level of caring and kinship. Veganism is a revolution of the heart.
Next up, we'll hear from Naeema Muhammad, who will be talking about the impact of hog farms in North Carolina communities and her important work with the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network.
Hello, my name is Naeema Muhammad, and I am the organizing director for the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. The North Carolina Environmental Justice Network is an organization that was founded in 1998 in as a part of a regional organization to address environmental concerns that was impacting um, predominantly African American, Native American, Latinx communities, but was not a part of the conversation uh, amongst the traditional environmental groups that was addressing environmental issues, but never anything addressing the human impact of environmental harms. And so the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network came together to begin looking at these issues and to also engage these same communities in the conversation about the environment, because during that time, back during the time we formed, there was not a lot of conversation in the Black and brown communities about environmental uh, justice or any kind of concerns about the environment. People knew something was changing in their communities, but they didn't have any idea what it was and why it was. And one of the largest things that we found to be a problem in our communities was the industrial agriculture, as they call it. Um, but it's where they're keeping animals confined into small spaces. Um, During the beginning of this time, we were talking about pigs and pigs only. Smithfield came to town, and as Smithfield came to town and began this industrialized agriculture, um, they the growth of the pigs was very rapid, and we went from a few pigs up to 10 million pigs in North Carolina. By mapping the permits, we found that the 10 million pigs was mostly in Eastern North Carolina, sitting in predominantly African American communities, Native American and Latinx communities, and we deemed this environmental racism because we felt like these communities were intentionally targeted because of being perceived to have very little political and economic power to fight off this company. Smithfield came to town; they were billionaires, and industrialized agriculture has brought them huge profits in North Carolina as a result of the way they raise these animals. So these industrialized agriculture, what it looks like is you can ride through any of the communities where these animals are, and you will see these metal housing, little metal houses, and each metal house could have up to 5,000 pigs inside the house. The space inside is um, very little space for that many animals. And so they are confined to these little cages. and it's very little room for the animals to move around. And as a result, they wind up with a lot of broken limbs and, a lot of aborted pigs and illnesses that take place inside these houses because of the close proximity of the animals to each other. So the industry's answer to that problem is to give these animals low doses of antibiotics and hormones on a daily basis. They say the antibiotics is to prevent illnesses, and the hormones we know will promote rapid growth. In their rush to get these pigs to the market, now it's just a matter of a few months that these animals go from babies to 350-pound animals to be taken slaughtered at the marketplace. Um, and Smithfield owned the largest slaughterhouse in the country, in the world, really. The world's largest slaughterhouse is in Tar Heel, North Carolina. Again, that's a part of the southeastern part of the state. They employ about 5,500 workers there, slaughtering about 39,000 pigs per day. The problem with this kind of industrialized agriculture is the waste management program that they have in North Carolina. They have called a lagoon and spray field system. And the lagoon, we always say to people, we're not talking about that blue lagoon that Brooke Shields hung out in. We're talking about a lagoon that's filled with nothing but feces and urine from all of these pigs. And these pigs, these 10 million pigs, are producing about 9 million tons of uh, animal waste on an annual basis that's going into our rivers and streams and on the land mass in eastern North Carolina. And the lagoon is just where they dug a hole in the ground and decided that this would be sufficient to hold the waste from these animals. And then everything that the animals do inside the hog houses, they have slats in the floor for the waste to filter through, and it falls through the cracks, and then it go into the pipes, and the pipes pipe it out to the lagoon, and it sits out in the air openly until they decide to irrigate it. So what they have to do is once those lagoons begin filling up, they then irrigate this waste out around the fields and crops in the communities. They call it fertilizer. They call it organic fertilizer. As a matter of fact, they told the community there was no harm to it and that, it was okay for them to be doing this. But the problem with the way they handle this waste and the irrigating of it and sitting out in those open air lagoons is that it has all kinds of toxic chemicals, and there's a lot of hydrogen sulfide that comes off of those lagoons because of that waste sitting out there, and it's making people in the community sick. As an organizer, I've been working with these communities since the early 2000s, and the things that I've heard people say is, it makes you sick. You get very nauseated. You throw up. Your eyes burn. Your nose run. You get headaches and just angry and frustrated from being forced to live like that. And the odors are so noxious to people don't want to be outside anymore. They say I don't want to go outside because it stinks so bad. And if I have things to do outside, I get up in the morning, I crack my door open just a little bit to see if it's stinking outside. If it's not stinking, then I rush out to do what I have to do so that I can get back in before the odor comes. Because once the odor comes, you do not want to be outside. And the thing that I've noticed in working in these communities, children love to be outdoors. They like playing outside and just being out. But you ride through these communities anytime. You could just pick a time on the hottest day in the summertime. You can ride through. You will not see children outside playing because of the odors and the flies that these animals bring into the community. It causes um, an overflux of flies, mosquitoes, snakes. People report, and I have witnessed buzzards sitting on what they call dead boxes. That these dead boxes look like a big trash dumpster that sits out at the highway in any community, and the workers at these hog houses, when the animals die there, they will take the dead animals from these hog houses and carry them to one of those dumpsters, and they call them dead boxes. And the dead boxes just sitting there, and they're dumping the dead animals. You can ride by a dead box at any time and see turkeys and chickens and pigs just piled up inside these dead boxes. Buzzards are lurking because it's food for them, and they're lurking around them, and they sit there until they have trucks that come by from time to time to pick these animals up. When the animals pile up, there are no tops on them, so they just sitting out there in the open. But these are the kinds of things that the community has to live with. And people have lost use of their property, so they are not able to enjoy their property on wells. They've been forced off of their wells because of ground contamination, because when they're spraying that waste, it's seeping into the soil, and so the ground was becoming contaminated. People began seeing that through changes in their well water. Some of the things they reported happening is that the water began to look murky, some of it looked milky, but more than that, the smells coming from their wells and the odors are just noxious. And like I said, it makes people sick. I remember one teacher reporting that at the school she worked, they were having issues there because the children would go in their lunchroom and get sick on the stomach trying to eat lunch because the odors was coming through the vents at the school. They have to buy bottled water in order to have enough clean water to take care of their daily needs. In 1997, there was a moratorium put in place by our General Assembly, um, to slow down the growth of the pork industry into North Carolina. And so the moratorium expired every 2 years. So every 2 years they was automatically renewing that moratorium. But in the year 2006, we heard talk that they may not renew that moratorium, which was coming up for renewal. Smithfield told the General Assembly that these community members were lying and making up this stuff, that there was no way that they were being impacted in the way that they were stating. And so as a result, researchers, not just in North Carolina, but from other states, began looking at the impacts of industrialized agriculture on humans, on human life. And as they did that, Dr. Wing in particular did a study called Community Health Effect of Industrialized Hog Operations. So what that in that research, he looked at the impact of this industry on people living in close proximity to these animals, and people were asked to sit outside twice a day, um, for 10 minutes at a time, once in the morning, once in the evening. And during that 10-minute period, we had designed a journal, and the journal had questions in it that they would have to answer while sitting outside. And we had listed all of the different symptoms that we had heard people talking about: the running nose, the burning eyes, the headaches, the frustration, the anger, the nausea, these things. And we asked people to check off any symptoms that showed up in them during this 10-minute period that they would sit outside. Once the 10 minutes were up, people were asked to go back inside. And once inside, they had to check their blood pressure, do a saliva sample. They were also asked to breathe flow meter. And as the results of that research showed that people had elevated blood pressures, there was a lot of upper respiratory problems, high rates of asthma, in particular, high rates of asthma amongst children. And so, there was all of these kinds of things that was recognized from the research. And we set up a mock hog farm. And so we had these two little hog houses sitting out on the grounds, and they were built by two of our community members. And then we bought two baby swimming pools and put them between the two hog houses and called them our lagoon. That was our lagoon. So once we set up our lagoon, we had trucks of organic fertilizer. Remember that word, organic fertilizer. We trucked in 40 gallons of organic fertilizer. And as we were pouring our organic fertilizer into our lagoon, the facilities manager for the state, managing those grounds and those facilities there that the legislative were housing, came over to us and asked us what were we doing. And we answered that we were setting up our lagoon. And he said, well, who told y'all to bring that waste out here? We said nobody, but didn't nobody tell us not to either. So then he said, well, if y'all spill one drop on this lawn out here, we're going to have to fine your organizations thousands of dollars clean up, because we're going to have to call in hazmat because this is toxic waste. We was like, toxic waste, really? Well, we didn't know that because they told us it was organic fertilizer. We only drove it 40 miles up the highway, so we don't understand how it went from being organic to toxic in that short distance. The industry kept telling the legislators it was organic fertilizer, and that's why they felt they should be able to spray it, irrigate it out on the crops around the community, because they said it was not harming anybody. But when it got to Raleigh, it was toxic waste. So, we already know what that meant. Anyway, so that's, what goes on in the communities that's having to live with these animals. So the end result of the 51-hour vigil was that they did reinstate the moratorium, because once we set up our mock hog farm, as the legislators walked by, they was like, what is that smell? And when we responded, our response was, it's 40 gallons of animal waste. You asking the community live with 19 million tons of this stuff every year. You can't take 40 gallons. What is the problem? And so the moratorium is still in effect as I speak to you all today. So hopefully, they will find there is another way and a better way for them to handle that animal waste. And Smithfield entered into an agreement in 2000 with the state of North Carolina, where they agreed to put superior technology on the ground to do away with this outdated lagoon and spray field system. And this is 2021, and they have not done it yet, and the state has not called their hand on it or forced them or made them live up to that agreement. Thank you so much. And again, I would like to thank the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. It's been my pleasure, and I hope that it's been yours.
After hearing all of this great information, you might be ready to put it into practice. So let's go to registered dietitian Maggie Neola, who will share a quick climate-friendly recipe.
Hi, I'm Maggie Neola, a dietitian at the Physicians Committee. Adding more plants to your plate is not only great for your health, but also for the environment. And today we're going to show you how to get started with adding more plants to your plate by making this recipe called Yes You Can Black Bean Chili. What's great about this recipe is that it features plant-based proteins like black beans and corn. A recent study showed that swapping beef for beans could actually help the US reach its target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And this recipe makes that exact swap. Not only is this bean-based chili super healthy, it's also delicious and really easy to make. So gather your ingredients and let's get started. Yes You Can black bean chili really is named appropriately because you can do it at home. It only takes 3 ingredients, and the cool thing about these ingredients is that you can keep them on hand at any time. So let's say you came back from a vacation and you have no food in the house, but you have these 3 and you're good to go for a quick meal that can be made in 10 minutes or less. So what you want to do is start off with black beans. These are really high in fiber and protein, and you can drain them, but keep that loca just in case you want to have a little more soupy of a chili. So we got 1 can there. The next is the frozen corn. You can use canned corn if you like, I just prefer frozen. So it's an entire bag of corn. Go ahead and put that in the pot there too. Nice medium pot will work. This serves about 4 people. And the last thing is the salsa. Be sure to pick your favorite kind of salsa because this is what adds a whole lot of flavor to your recipe. So we've got 1 jar right in there, and this is a pretty thick chili, which is how I like it. But if you want to thin it out, go ahead and grab some of that black bean juice here and just add a little more liquid. You don't have to use all of it. So we're going to mix that together. And what's really great about this is that it has 3 of the Power Plate food groups in there. So you've got legumes, grains, and vegetables. Really gonna help you feel full longer. Now all you gotta do is go ahead and put this on medium heat on your stovetop for about 10 minutes until it's warm. After 10 to 15 minutes, it's hot and ready to be served. So let's grab a nice big bowl here and a ladle and dish yourself out a nice portion of this chili. Now you could eat quite a bit of this, and feel free to eat as much as you want so that you feel full and ready to go with your day. All right, so we got this beautiful chili, and let's finish it off. Just add a little bit more brightness with a squeeze of lime on top. Very delicious, gonna make that flavor pop. And a nice cilantro garnish, of course. If you wanna go ahead and put some hot sauce on there to make it spicy, you could do that as well, or even some baked tortilla chips for some crunch. Enjoy a nice bowl of Yes You Can black bean chili. I hope you enjoyed making this recipe with me. For more amazing plant-based recipes and videos, sign up for our free 21-day vegan kickstart this month.
Next, we'll hear from Emma Finn, who serves as Friends of the Earth's climate-friendly school food program associate, where she works to make the K-12 food system healthier, more climate-friendly, and more equitable across communities.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emma Finn. I work with Friends of the Earth on our climate-friendly school food team. Friends of the Earth is an environmental and social justice advocacy organization working on multiple environmental campaigns, ranging from protecting organic agriculture and our oceans from fossil fuel projects to promoting clean energy solutions that are community controlled and to foster a regenerative economy. We work to build long-term collective power to fight for a just, systemic transformation. Today, I'd like to present to you all of the findings from our recent report highlighting the state of school lunch in California and key opportunities for change at the local, state, and federal levels. To better understand the opportunities for improving the environmental and health profile of California's school meals, we did a deep dive into California school lunch menus and USDA foods purchasing. First, we analyzed over 1,300 lunch entrees served at the 25 largest K-12 public school districts in California during the month of October 2019 to identify the top menu items and relative frequency of meat and dairy-centric versus plant-based lunch entrees. We also examined California's bulk food spending through the USDA Foods program and identified the companies that benefit the most from this taxpayer-funded program. Companies like Tyson, which is producing 100% industrial factory-farmed meat and poultry, meaning massive, polluting, inhumane factory conditions that have huge negative health and environmental externalities. We focused on the USDA Foods program because it is a major subsidy to school districts that largely determines what ends up on the menus. We also calculated the carbon footprints of top lunch entrees and estimated greenhouse gas emissions associated with California's USDA Foods bulk food purchasing. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we make policy recommendations to better align menus with public health recommendations and California's climate and sustainable food procurement goals. We specifically focused on the amount of plant-based foods relative to meat-centric dishes, since, as you see in this slide, virtually every public health organization urges greater consumption of plant-based foods and lower red and processed meat consumption for better health outcomes. And most importantly for school food, which operates under the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA's dietary guidelines also reference the importance of eating more plant-based foods. The most recent 2020 guidelines point out that 3/4 of Americans exceed recommendations for meat and poultry, but don't get enough nuts, seeds, and soy products. So after analyzing over 1,300 menu items, what did we find? We found that the vast majority of school lunch entrees offered in California feature animal protein, while just 4% of entrees were plant-based. And of those animal proteins, 16% of entrees contain processed meat. That's your pepperoni, your hot dogs, your deli meats on school lunch menus. And processed meats are known carcinogens, according to the World Health Organization, meaning that 16% of those entrees contain cancer-causing foods. What you're looking at now are the top 10 entrees gleaned from California school district menus. Red meat dishes make up 4 of the 10 most frequently offered entrees, with cheeseburgers, beef crumble dishes, hot dogs, and meat pizzas offered most frequently. The bean and cheese entrees are the only top entree in which any part of the protein requirement is fulfilled by a plant protein. It is also important to point out that 3 of the most frequently offered menu items contain processed meats, which is clearly out of alignment with all leading public health recommendations. Now, what about the climate impact of these meals? As you can see here, the beef and cheese featured on school menus dominate climate impacts. On school lunch menus in California, beef represents only 16% of total menu offerings, yet it accounts for over 60% of the carbon footprint. Meanwhile, plant-based proteins, such as beans, tofu, and lentils, make up 4% of the entrees offered, yet represent only 1% of the carbon footprint. Many districts provide vegetarian options, but they use cheese to fulfill the meat alternate requirement. However, these cheese dishes are neither low carbon nor particularly healthy, often being high in saturated fats and sodium. This next figure compares the relative carbon footprint per serving of the top 10 entrees I showed earlier. Beef entrees by far carry the largest carbon footprint and are also among the most frequently offered menu items. Beef items are typically 15 times more carbon intensive than the bean and cheese entrees. In addition to the menu research, as I mentioned before, we looked at USDA foods purchasing data in the state of California because USDA foods really drives what is on the menu. For example, in 2014, a study found that 70% of USDA commodity funds nationally were spent on just 4 types of foods: raw beef, mozzarella cheese, cheddar cheese, and chicken. And these 4 types of food made up 88% of the USDA foods sent for processing into foods like hamburgers, pizza, and chicken nuggets, all of which appear frequently on California school food menus. According to 2018-19 data we analyzed, California school districts spent nearly 3/4 of their USDA food dollars, totaling $117 million annually, on industrially produced animal products. Only 2% of purchases went to plant-based foods, and beans and nut butter are the only plant-based sources of protein available through USDA foods. What is perhaps even more troubling is the fact that the largest meat and dairy conglomerates have monopolized the USDA foods market. For example, Tyson Foods, the biggest meat and poultry producer in the United States, also recently in the news for exploiting workers during the pandemic, supplies 44% of all poultry purchased in California schools through USDA foods. In each of these top 4 protein categories, just 3 companies dominate 70% of the sales to California schools. So rather than supporting independent, local, or organic producers and keeping these dollars flowing into our local economies, this tax-funded program at USDA Foods is locking school districts into supporting corporate-controlled, highly concentrated, polluting animal agriculture entities that are also dangerous and exploitative for workers. We know that school districts function within extremely limited budgets, and they are given dollars that can only be used for USDA foods at below market rates, which incentivizes these kinds of purchases and puts many food service directors who are doing the best they can with limited resources in a near impossible situation. The good news is that we can change this, and many school food service directors are already making important menu shifts. Many school districts across California are serving plant-based and plant-forward menu options, and they're doing it successfully with menu items that students love and that save the district money. Here are some recent photos of climate-friendly food in California public schools. Even when facing a national pandemic and food supply shortages, districts are making climate-friendly food a reality. On the far left, we have a food service staff member from Ojai Unified preparing cabbage. This district has successfully eliminated all red meat from its menus and continues to do so. The middle photo highlights the well-loved organic Thai basil lentil burger from San Luis Coastal Unified. Food Service Director Erin Primer spoke during one of our recent school food webinars about how her organic lentil burger is praised by both vegetarians and meat eaters alike. Her plant-forward meal kits at the start of the pandemic were so popular that they have now become the default option for all meal kits being sent home during COVID-19. The last photo is from Encinitas Union, showing paper bags that have been filled with fresh organic produce from the Organic Certified Farm Lab and milk for distance learners. While we know that the school lunch program has been crucial to fighting food insecurity and meal quality has improved in recent years, our research found significant misalignment with leading public health organizations' recommendations around less meat and more plants, as well as our state's climate goals. I also want to emphasize that this analysis is not in any way intended to critique individuals or school districts. Most food service directors are doing everything they can to satisfy kids' picky eating habits within tight budgets, strict regulations, challenging staffing situations, and inadequate kitchen facilities. And we know that despite these challenges, schools have made remarkable progress towards serving healthier, plant-based, and organic food in public schools. Ultimately, the focus of this report is to illuminate policy and structural changes needed to better align school lunch menus with leading public health guidance for healthy eating and climate science. And if you find our website, you can look at all of these policy recommendations that we've outlined at every level. I hope we can inspire people to get more involved and to work with us, especially this coming year, as we have new opportunities to influence school food policy with a new administration in place at USDA and the planned upcoming focus on child nutrition legislation in Congress. I also want to leave you on a positive note with a tangible way school districts can bring change and a path forward. We call this image the burger swap. This graphic shows that if all school districts in California swapped out one beef burger for one black bean burger just once a month, it would save 220 million pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent, the same as taking 22,000 cars off the road for a year, growing 1.7 million tree seedlings for a period of time, or converting 26,000 residential solar systems for a year. And that is just one swap. So I hope you all have learned something today. Thank you so much for having me. We look forward to hearing from you. Please email us at climatefriendlyfood@friendsoftheearth.org or visit our website at foe.org/schoolfoodpurchasing. Take care.
Next, we'll hear from Dr. Michael Greger, a physician, best-selling author, and founder of nutritionfacts.org, about the link between the environment, emerging diseases, and our diets. And we'll hear about steps that we can take today to prevent the next pandemic from ever occurring.
Over the last few decades, hundreds of human pathogens have emerged at a rate unprecedented in human history. Say, wait a second, emerged? From where? I did most of my postgraduate medical training taking care of AIDS patients. I remember thinking to myself, when I was growing up, there's no such thing as HIV/AIDS. From where do emerging diseases emerge, mostly from animals, the original source of nearly all major infectious diseases. Tuberculosis, which continues to kill about 1 million people every year, is thought to have been acquired through the domestication of goats. Measles also jumped from goats or sheep, killing about 200 million people over the last 150 years. And speaking of hundreds of millions dead, smallpox, which seems to have been a result of camel domestication. We domesticated pigs and got whooping cough. We domesticated chickens and got typhoid fever, and domesticated ducks and got influenza. Leprosy came from water buffalo, and the common cold from cattle or horses. I mean, how often did wild horses have the opportunity to sneeze into humanity's collective face until they were broken and bridled, right? Until then, the common cold was presumably only common to them. In fact, the reason European diseases wiped out the Native Americans and not vice versa is because there were no epidemic diseases in the Americas. No goats, so no TB. I mean, the last ice age wiped out American camels, so no smallpox. Buffalo, but no domesticated buffalo, so no measles. Humanity's biblical dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heaven, and every living thing that moved over the earth has unleashed a veritable Pandora's ark full of humanity's greatest killers. But wait, animals were domesticated thousands of years ago. Why all these new diseases now? Well, we have changed the way animals live on a global scale. The AIDS virus is blamed on the butchering of primates and the bushmeat trade in Africa. Mad cow disease was because we turned cows into natural herbivores like cows into kind of carnivores and cannibals. SARS and COVID-19 have been traced back to the exotic wild animal trade. Our last pandemic, though, swine flu in 2009, arose not from some backwater wet market in Asia, but was largely made in the USA on industrial pig operations in the United States. Thankfully, swine flu only killed about 500,000 people. The next time, we might not be so lucky. COVID-19 may just be a dress rehearsal for an even greater threat waiting in the wings of chickens. In 1997, a flu virus called H5N1 was discovered in chickens that would forever change our understanding of how bad pandemics could get. So far, it's remained largely a disease of poultry, not people, but of the hundreds of individuals that have become infected, more than half have died. A flu virus with a human case fatality rate exceeding 50%. I mean, what if a virus like that were to mutate to acquire easy human-to-human transmissibility? I mean, the last time a bird flu virus jumped directly into humans and caused a pandemic, it triggered the deadliest plague in human history, the 1918 pandemic, which killed 50 million people. The deadliest plague in human history had a 2% death rate. Well, if we had a pandemic infecting billions where, death was more like Ebola, a flip of a coin. The COVID-19 pandemic has been devastating, but look, food is still being restocked on grocery store shelves. The internet may be slow, but it's still up. The lights are still on, and safe drinking water is still flowing from the tap. Doctors and nurses are still showing up to work. I mean, if the predictions are correct and only, a few 100,000 Americans die, I mean, that would be, 1 in, 2,000 or so. In the pandemic of 1918, in which, 2% of the cases succumbed, 1 in every 150 Americans died. Imagine if it was 10 times as bad as 2%, with 1 in 15 dying, right? Or 25 times as bad with 1 in 6. The good news is there something we can do about it? Just as eliminating the exotic animal trade and live animal markets may go a long way towards preventing the next coronavirus pandemic, reforming the way we raise domestic animals for food may help forestall the next killer flu. The unprecedented emergence of H5N1 and 10 other bird flu viruses infecting people around the world, newly infecting people, has been blamed on industrial poultry production. For example, a quote from the United Nations: "Governments, local authorities, and international agencies need to take a greatly increased role in combating the role of factory farming, which, combined with live animal markets, provide ideal conditions for the flu virus to spread and mutate into a more dangerous form." Unquote. Happy to share with you invite a review I published in the Critical Reviews in Microbiology, where I talk about all the evidence and underlying evolutionary biological theory. But basically, the H5N1 virus started out like all bird flu viruses as a harmless, waterborne intestinal infection of waterfowl, but gained airborne transmission and the ramping up of extreme virulence within these massive, intensive poultry production operations. Why? Because when we overcrowd tens of thousands of animals in these cramped, filthy football field-sized sheds that lie beak to beak atop their own waist, it's just a breeding ground for a disease. There's the sheer number of animals, the overcrowding, the stress crippling their immune systems, the ammonia from the decomposing waste burning their lungs, lack of fresh air, lack of sunlight. Put all these factors together, what you really have is kind of the perfect storm environment for the emergence and spread of so-called super strains of influenza. Currently, the CDC considers the bird flu virus H7N9 to be our gravest threat, with a case fatality rate of 40%, killing about 600 of the first 1,500 people it's infected. A published estimate of what H7N9 pandemic might look like in the United States concluded millions of Americans dead. A pandemic with more than just a few percent mortality wouldn't just threaten financial markets, but civilization itself as we know it. How can we stop the emergence of pandemic viruses in the first place? If there was just one concept to draw on my work about preventing and reversing chronic diseases, it's that whenever possible we should treat the cause. The American Public Health Association, the largest and oldest association of public health professionals in the world, has called for a moratorium on factory farming. Maybe COVID-19 is the dry run we needed, the fire drill to awake us out of our complacency and reform the food system before it's too late. The Pew Commission on Industrial Farm Animal Production cites the human health risks as a reason to abolish gestation crates for pregnant pigs. The rise in stress hormone levels in crated sows is thought to be the result of the interference with the expression of natural maternal behaviors like nest building, which results in impaired immunity. They produce lower levels of antibodies in response to an experimental challenge. Measures as simple as providing straw bedding appears to decrease swine influenza rates, presumably by eliminating the immunosuppressive stress of lying on bare concrete their whole lives. Yet the pigs are often denied even this modicum of mercy, to their detriment and potentially to ours as well. For chickens raised for meat, we can decrease stocking densities to give them more breathing room. They're the ones who could use a little social distancing right now. Researchers have demonstrated a 100% contact transmission rate of H5N1 between chickens housed at the standard stocking densities, but the transmission rate was cut in half or even eliminated when birds' living space was doubled. We could also push for slower-growing breeds, breeding for production traits, like increased breast muscle in birds raised for meat or increased laying ability in egg breeds. Seems to necessarily mean breeding for decreased immune function. Studies show that old-fashioned, slower-growing chicken breeds have larger and better developed antibody-producing immune organs. Instead of being bred to transfer the bulk of resources to build breast meat while neglecting other needs, these slower-growing breeds have sufficient resources to foster a more functional antibody response. Let me share with you an editorial published in the Journal of the American Public Health Association that goes beyond just calling for reform and de-intensification of the poultry industry, but instead questions the prudence of raising so many animals for food in the first place. It is curious, the editorial reads, given the pandemic threat, that changing the way humans treat animals, most basically ceasing to eat them, or at least radically limiting the quantity of them that is eaten, is largely off the radar as a significant preventive measure. Such a change, if sufficiently adopted or imposed, could still reduce the chances of the much-feared influenza epidemic. It would be even more likely to prevent unknown future diseases that, in the absence of this change, may result from farming animals intensively and killing them for food. Yet humanity doesn't even consider this option." Unquote. However, thanks to food innovations, this may be changing. Look at the dairy case these days. Some of America's largest dairy producers have filed for bankruptcy due to the constellation of new consumer choices. And we're starting to see the same thing in the meat aisle. No longer a kind of a niche market for vegetarians, major meat producers, Tyson, Smithfield, Purdue, Hormel have already started to help innovate us out of this precarious situation by making hybrid or completely plant-based meats. There are headlines like KFC to roll out Cargill's plant-based chicken across China. Talk about a cultural revolution. We're not talking about tofurkey, right? Cargill is America's largest private corporation, one of the biggest meat packers in the world. And for those of you thinking, you'll have to pry that pork chop out of my cold, dead hand, well, I've got good news for you too. You may be able to have your meat and eat it too by cultivating meat from muscle cells, right? You don't have to worry about intestinal bugs, E. coli, Campylobacter, Salmonella, if you're producing meat without intestines. You don't have to cook the crap out of the meat if there's no crap to begin with, just like you don't have to worry about brewing up new respiratory viruses if you're making meat without the lungs. Cultivated meat, and even much of the plant-based meat, isn't necessarily great from a kind of a personal health standpoint, but from a pandemic threat standpoint, zero risk. In this new age of emerging diseases, there are now billions of feathered and curly-tailed test tubes for viruses to incubate and mutate within, billions more spins at pandemic roulette. We may be one bushmeat meal away from the next HIV, one pangolin plate away from the next killer coronavirus, and one factory farm away from the next deadly flu. Along with human culpability, though, comes hope. If changes in human behavior can cause new plagues, well, then maybe changes in human behavior may prevent them in the future. Though it may take a pandemic with a virus like H5N1 or H7N9 before the world realizes the true cost of cheap chicken.
Now we'll hear from Dr. Martin Heller from the Center of Sustainable Systems at the University of Michigan, who researches the sustainability of the food system.
I want to start at a fairly high level and just consider a little bit why we might need to consider the planet in our eating. What's the problem here? Well, to put it simply, the bottom line is with a global population of 7.8 billion, feeding all of those hungry mouths is really, is really putting an impact on the natural resources and environmental impact of our planet. And this shows up in things like upwards of 30% of greenhouse gas emissions coming from food and agriculture, as much as 90% of global freshwater consumption being consumed in agricultural practices. 38% of ice-free land area is occupied by agriculture. And that's not just the ice-free land area that we as humans occupy, but across the whole planet. So it also means that agriculture is a major driver of biodiversity loss. And here we're seeing a little time lapse of the disappearance of the Amazonian rainforest by agriculture. And of course, that has a big impact on biodiversity. Equally as dramatic is agriculture's contribution to nutrient enrichment in waterways. And this plays out in ways like the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, where agricultural practices throughout the Mississippi River Basin leach nutrients into the Mississippi River. They end up in the Gulf of Mexico, which basically ends up depleting the oxygen in parts of the Gulf to the point where nothing can live there. So major impacts coming from agriculture. And as we all know, we anticipate seeing continued population growth, at least until the end of this century. And along with that, increased prosperity, which often leads to an increased demand for animal-based foods. This projection from FAO suggests a 76% increase in meat demand by 2050. There's a growing recognition that in order for us to meet those future food demands within the limits of our little planet, within what our planet can support, it's really going to require more than just doing agriculture better. This is most especially played out in differences between animal and plant-based foods, which of course shows up often in our typical protein sources. we looked at these sort of reduction scenarios in a different light. And what if we were able to, by 2030, realize a 50% reduction in animal-based foods across the board? So that includes meats, that includes dairy, it includes eggs, it includes fish and seafood, 50% reduction of all of those, substituting with plant-based equivalents. And what we found is that's a huge reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions. It amounts to taking 47.5 million cars off the road for a year. Just if we reduced our food by, our animal-based foods by 50%. Again, if we put that in terms of these reductions that we need to meet a climate change target, almost a quarter of those reductions from this 50% reduction in our diets. And if we took that a bit farther and said, okay, 50% reduction in all animal-based foods, but let's take our reduction of beef to 90% of our current intake. And of course, that would push it even farther and represent a reduction of 30%, 36% of the necessary emission reductions to meet those UN goals. So again, you know, the point here is we can make very significant impacts on some of these environmental influences by what seem like fairly reasonable changes in our diet, and as you all know, changes that would also likely be beneficial to our health. I think that it's fair to say that here in the Anthropocene, food represents one of the greatest health and environmental challenges that we have over the next century, right? We've really got to find a way to do this right, to figure it out. And agriculture, food production is having a big impact on our planet, on our environment. We're expecting that to continue because of population growth, because of ongoing demand for animal-based foods. But what we also see is that diet has important consequences on these environmental impacts, that there are ways of lessening our impact by simply looking at changing our diet. And I should add here that those of us in developed world, in the industrialized world, that are already used to these very rich diets, very animal-based, animal-centric diets, have a much larger role to play here when we consider it in a global perspective. But, you know, if we were to sum it all up, I think that, once again, Michael Pollan kind of nailed it here, right? Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That gets you most of the way there when we're talking about environmental impacts as well, which is fortunate because we're seeing a lot of agreement, right, with what we see with health considerations as well. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate you tuning in today.
Now we're going to hear about sustainability through traditional native foods and practices from Chef Lois Ellen Frank, who's a New Mexico-based chef, author, native foods historian, and founder of Red Mesa Cuisine, LLC.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chef Lois Ellen Frank, and I am the chef owner of Red Mesa Cuisine in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I'm just going to talk to you about the sacredness of some of the foods that we use and how that plays a role as a chef in what I do. I work a lot with corn, beans, and squash. This is called the Three Sisters. And it's called the Three Sisters not only because of the nutrients that they provide, but also how they grow. And what's fascinating about these three is that corn needs nitrogen from the soil, and beans give nitrogen. And so together, these two sisters really were sort of a gift to Native people, and many Native communities believe this. And beans need a pole to climb, and so corn is that perfect pole. And squash has big leaves, and it shades the ground, keeping moisture in and weeds out. So these plants are like a family. They have a relationship, and the way they grow and the way they want to grow is really important in Native cooking, Native American cuisine, Native ideology. And so I work a lot with the Three Sisters, and you can actually see here that I have some corn. A lot of the corn we use is a corn that's a native corn that grows, and we use the whole kernel, and we grind that into a powder. And we make a lot of dishes like corn mush and corn pudding and atole and breads and dumplings. And when this corn is treated, when we put it into ash, it becomes this corn over here, which is actually a treated corn. Some tribes call it a lye corn. Some tribes know it as a hominy corn. We actually know it here in New Mexico as a pozole, and that's a Spanish word for a treated corn. And when you cook that corn, it puffs. And it's really nutritious. It's really delicious. And it's pretty amazing. And then beans, I have lots of beans here. We have some that are drought tolerant. They come in all shapes and sizes and colors. I sort of think as beans like us, they're seeds and we're all different. My mom always said growing up that corn comes in 4 colors. And those 4 colors are yellow, white, black, and red. Those are the 4 colors on the medicine wheel. Those are the 4 races of man. Those are what makes up this earth. And so we're all earth people. And one of the most fascinating things is the relationship we have. Not only the relationship with the land, but the relationship that we have with the food. And for me personally, as a chef, I know every farmer that supplies food for me. I know how they grow the food, where their farm is, the care that they take. And they're all different. Some of the farmers that I work with supply me with heirloom tomatoes that I can every year. And we're talking about hundreds of pounds. I make jars and jars and jars so that I can use those tomatoes throughout the year. And Timaya is my supplier for the corn that I use. And Ramona Farms supplies some of the beans that I use. And the squash might come from Matt Romero at Romero Farms or Jose Gonzalez at Gonzalez Farm. And so there's a relationship, not only with the land, but the food. And as a chef, for me, this is really important. I want to know where my food comes from. I want to know how it was grown. I want to know that it was grown without pesticides and without toxins. I want to know that the earth is clean. And I want to know that the farmer cares about the plants as much as I do. And maybe he talks to them, or maybe he sings to them and helps those crops to grow. So I call this a foodscape. And I think it's really important to contextualize why would someone come to New Mexico when you could get these ingredients or you could order them online anywhere, because of that connection that we have to the land and the food and the actual soil, the altitude, the amount of rain, the minerals and the ingredients in the soil influence how the food tastes. So our chilies here have lots of flavor. And I'm probably biased because I've lived in New Mexico since the 80s, but the reason it tastes so good is because of the land. And so this is a foodscape. This is a way that we connect. This is why people come here, to experience the flavors of the land and to experience that connection to place. And that's a really important part of what we do at Red Mesa. I work with Chef Walter Whitewater, and we want to leave all the negative at the door, and we want to focus on the positive, and we want to put love and care and a consciousness into the foods that we serve. And that has to come from the time it's a seed to when it's planted and grown. And then I get it, and then I touch it, and I make it into something, and then I feed it to you. And that, for me, is that cycle, that connection that we all have to the land. And the land is vitally important here. We can't be healthy people without healthy land. It's impossible. And a native way of looking at things is to think about the fact that everything is connected. So if we have this circle and we have these 4 colors of corn, if you do something, it affects everything because it's a circle. You can't do something to one component and not have it affect everything. And that's really, really important when we think about land and we think about food and we think about this need, this important desire to tend to and take care of the land, not only for our own health and wellness, but for the generations that are yet to come. This is a really important way of looking at how we live as Earth people, how we live on the land. I think it's a vital part of who I am as a chef. So one of the things that I've done, and I teach on the college level, and I always tell my students that we need to address a problem, but I'm very solution orientated. How do I make a difference every day? Every day, what can I do? And one of the things that I've done just on the land where this kitchen is and where I live and where I work, and we've planted what's called an edible landscape. And so we took native indigenous plants, one of which is chokecherries, and we planted them and they've spread. And now just from the edible landscape in my front yard, which is actually watered from the rain that we get every summer. And chokecherry is very, very important, not only in my native lineage, but to many native tribes. And we harvest anywhere from 20 to 35 pounds of chokecherries. And that includes leaving some for the plant to regenerate itself, but also some for the animals, the birds and the squirrels and the creatures that we share this earth with. And so when you think about what can you do, you can plant an edible landscape. You can take what I call an acceptance garden. What has nature given you? And accept that and help those to grow and help those to propagate on their own so that we can feed butterflies and bees and birds and bunnies and everyone that we share the earth with, and also take some of that food for ourselves and our families. And so this is also a way of being in the world, a way of being on our own land, in our own landscapes, is to plant foods that plants that generate food. And this is really important. And a lot of this knowledge, a lot of this information comes from the ancestors. And so in all of our lineages, in all of our indigenousness, we can re-indigenize who we are. Everybody's indigenous and everybody comes from somewhere. And what did our ancestors do that made the world we live in and the land we live on sustainable? What did they do and what can we do as individuals? And I think the power of one is so underrated because we do have a lot of power. And one can turn into 10, which can turn into 100, which can turn into 1,000,000, which can turn into 100 million. And so if we all take responsibility and we all do something to better the land and the food and the plants that we share this land with, I think the world's going to be a better place. And I think that's really important when we look towards the future and making sure that for the next 7 generations, our children and their children and their children have safe, clean, healthy plants to eat and for food. I'm going to introduce Chef Walter Whitewater, and he's the chef I work with at Red Mesa Cuisine. And one of the things that we do together, come on in, Walter, is we bring in the element of song, because songs are prayers, and that element connects us not only to the land, but to the plants and the food that we serve. And so Walter's going to do a little song for us. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Walter Whitewater. I'm Jenné. I'm originally from a place called Pinon, Arizona. Yate, and it's one of the traditional ways that we use our language and we connect with the plants. The plant base is that's the most sacred plant that we use to heal people with, and respect the other part. So anyway, I'm going to sing a song here and end it with the song. There's always a gathering, and so there's always a calling in the grandfather or the spirit, as we say, and then saying thank you at the end with the strum here, and it's the heartbeat, and as they say, one mind, one heart, one beat, as the word goes. So anyway, here it goes. Thank you.
And so the thought of the song, the thought of this goes out, and we all feel it and we live it, and it connects us to the land and to our food and to our sacred plants.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much, Chef Lois. Thank you, Chef Welcher. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you to all of our presenters for tremendous presentations. And now for those of you who have been participating, this is your time to ask questions that you may have. And to take your questions, let me invite a panel of speakers, Dr. Joanne Kahn, Dr. Michael Greger, Dr. Leslie Duram, and Chef Lois Ellen Frank, and also Emma Finn, if you'd please join us. And thanks to all of you for being here. I loved what you had to present. Thank you very much. So if you have a question, please just ask them in the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can. So go ahead, you find the chat box there, give us your questions. All right, I'm seeing the first question here is for Dr. Kong. Dr. Kong, Linda is looking for a quick stat or two to include in an elevator pitch about a plant-based diet for the environment that she can quickly share with others. So, Dr. Kong, what would you include in an elevator pitch, so to speak?
Hi, Linda. That's a terrific question. Going plant-based is the single most powerful and effective thing that any of us can do to help save the environment and sustain future generations. Our important role as we talk to others is to raise awareness that the current ways of producing food centered around the consumption of animals is the largest source of environmental devastation. It truly is the single most destructive industry on Earth. It's the leading driver of climate change, accounting for over 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's a leading cause of water and air pollution, soil erosion and degradation, deforestation, and thus it is the #1 cause of species and habitat loss. By going plant-based, we could save 70 to 80% of the land, water, and energy resources currently used for using animals as a food source. And if you go vegan, did you know you can cut your carbon footprint in half, use 1/13 of the water and 1/18 of the land resources used by a typical meat consumer? In a month, you could save over 30,000 gallons of water, over 1,000 pounds of grain, and in 1 year, save an acre of trees. And realize this, huge amounts of plant crops are consumed by livestock. Yet meat eaters receive only 30% of that plant's energy. The other 70% is lost through the animal's bodily functions, waste, and so on. So why not just eat the plants directly and get all the fantastic nutritional benefits and also avoid the negative health impacts of eating animals? One of my favorite quotes is by Gary Yourofsky, animal advocate, who used to say, "Don't use the animal as a filter, eat plants directly.
I love it. Thank you. That's fantastic. I have a question for Dr. Greger. Dr. Greger, Mark is asking if meat and dairy corporations are lobbying and fighting against the plant-based environmental messages. And if so, is there anything that we as individuals can do about that?
Oh, that's a great question. That's not something that I've been had on my radar. Maybe someone else on the panel may be able to chime in on that. But certainly in the nutrition realm, there continues to be a cacophony of noise from both the meat, dairy, egg, and junk food industries to try to muddy the waters, even though there's been a consensus as to the core tenets of healthy eating and healthy living going back decades in the peer-reviewed scientific literature.
Great. Well, let me ask if any of the other panelists wanted to weigh in on that very question. I don't know if any of you are finding that you're fighting against the meat industry, the dairy industry. And if so, do you have suggestions for things that we as individuals can do to fight back? Anybody want to jump in on that? All right, you're off the hook for now. Let me go to Dr. Duram. I have a question from Liz. Liz is wondering how faux meats like Beyond Beef, Beyond Meat, or the Impossible Burger, how do they impact the environment? Are they better than meat?
So maybe the short answer is yes. I like to think of these as the Beyond Impossible products. So they are possibly better as a stepping stone, right? They're better than beef, lower greenhouse gases, although there's some question about that. I think if you look on their websites, for example, they have some data on there, 80%, 90%, but I'm not sure about that methodology necessarily. But I think, one, they're kind of getting people to talk about plant-based diets, so that's a plus. But in the long term, we need bigger things than that. Worried about one burger here or there, a fake product here or there. These products still are taking like 15 or 20 different ingredients from around the world. They're super high in fat. I know one of them is based on soy and the other is a pea protein, but they still have a lot of added fats and various stabilizers and this sort of thing. So you're still bringing all these ingredients across the planet and producing them and manufacturing them, right? I mean, it's a factory manufacturing and then packaging and then shipping them, refrigerated shipping. Like, why can't you just make a bean burger, right? Beans and some spices and flour to hold it together. My husband's bean burgers are great. So why not just do that? I don't understand. But again, as a stepping stone, that's fine. But if we really, if you listen to my talk there, we need big action to address greenhouse gas emissions. And to do that, plant-based diet, eating real food, plant-based whole foods, plant-based real foods, that's the way we all need to go.
Great, terrific. Over to Chef Lois. Chef Lois, we have Ev is wondering if you have tips for a cold climate. It sounds like she's cooking with local fruits and vegetables, but she's looking at the winter months. She's in a colder climate and wanting to stop relying as much as possible on foods that have been shipped long distances. What do you think?
I think that's a great question. And I think that eating seasonally is very, very healthy. So, when we get into the spring, we have our baby greens and we have sheets of things, and we get into the summer, full harvest, fall, full harvest. And then in the winter months, that's when we would traditionally eat the dried chilies, the dried corn, the dried beans. Of course, beans we can eat all year round because they last. And I'm a big advocate for beans, and I love the bean juice. So I use that a lot when I cook. But I think that eating seasonally, the body adapts. I know I definitely feel and want and crave heartier meals in the winter and lighter meals. Yesterday, I wanted a salad, and I made a beautiful salad with microgreens and all the little spring foods, and it was lovely. So I did add a little bit of nuts, and it was just a perfect salad. So again, listen to your body and eat with the seasons. Eat
And I think that's perfect for something when we talk about climate, because that's traditionally how Native people have followed and eaten for millennia.
Great, perfect. Let's see, let me go to Emma Finn. Amy has a question for you, and she asks if you have tips for how she can talk to her kids' school about introducing plant-based options in their lunch program. I'll bet you that is a question for so many people. Emma, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I definitely think the first step would be to ask what is needed for a food service director at a school district to make those changes. Each school district operates very differently. You know, there's different staffing, there's different infrastructure challenges, kitchen equipment, and different reimbursement levels, different budgets. Most school districts operate in the black or in the red, so they don't have a lot of flexibility with their budget. But I think asking, you know, is there a way to swap a beef burger for a veggie patty? You know, simple changes like that have a huge impact on the climate, let alone your own personal health. Now, understanding the landscape of where a food service director is operating is key in order to be able to support their program, because ultimately you want to support them in their work in order for more students to be able to buy into the program, because the more students that participate in the program, the more money that food service directors have in order to make big menu shifts.
Now, while I've got you, Emma, tell me about eating local from your standpoint. We were talking with Chef Lois about that. What do you make of that? And do you have some tips for people who would like to eat locally more?
Yeah, I mean, eating local is a huge way to not only reduce, you know, the carbon footprint that's associated with transportation and food, but also supporting local farmers, smaller producers. I think it's really important to, you know, for people that don't have access to, let's say, a farmer's market or, you know, local produce in the grocery store, we need to support legislation that will actually bring smaller producers into grocery stores, like food hubs. You know, there's legislation in California that's up right now. And it's about calling your legislators to support opportunities for smaller producers, BIPOC farmers, farmers of color, women farmers, you know, get that local food into the places that we can buy.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let me raise a question for Dr. Kong again. This is from Gina, and I want to hear your answer to this, Dr. Kong. She says, would there really be enough plants to feed the global population if everybody switched to a plant-based diet? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a real common question. And first, it's worth noting that at least 30% of the ice-free land on the planet is used for grazing and growing animal feed, yet this produces only 18% of total global food calories. Now, people will ask, gee, if the whole world went vegan, doesn't it mean we're going to need way more land and resources to grow plant foods? But realize that all of this livestock, they're consuming plants. On average, producing 1 pound of animal protein requires 15 pounds of plant protein. And meat production uses about 16 times more land than plant-based food of roughly equivalent nutrition. So if we made a global move to plant foods instead of diverting those crops to farmed animals, we wouldn't have to grow as many crops, and we could actually free up over 70% of global croplands. Right now, the world actually produces enough plant calories to feed 10 to 11 billion people, but nearly half of these food crops go to farmed animals. And in the US, it's at least 70%. Farmed animals actually consume 5 times the amount of grain as Americans. So this all factors in as a driving force behind world hunger too, because you have crops that are being directed to animals rather than to the people who need them the most. So our food revolution really needs to be focused on a global commitment to agricultural practices that produce a rich diversity of nutritious plant foods. And we also have, with our spirit of innovation, there are so many exciting things happening with vertical farming, hydroponics, aeroponics, where you can grow large quantities of plant foods in small areas with much, much less resources. So there are so many exciting possibilities for us to move towards plant-based eating.
Okay, that's great. It sounds like not only are there, would we be have plenty of plants to eat, we would have no trouble with that, but it sounds like we're actually going to be using fewer plants, less land, if we're not raising so much in the way of feed grains for livestock. I love it. Is that right? Did I get that right?
Yes, that's right. And
Okay.
at this point, we really, humanity really is at a point now where we are placing the greatest amount of damage on the planet and our resources. And we have to find ways to cut back on the amount of agricultural resources and land that we're using. So that's why it's so highly critical that we center our policies and everything we do as consumers on moving the plant-based industries forward.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Let me bring Dr. Greger back in. Dr. Greger, I'll bet you hear this all the time. I do. People saying, I read in a magazine about a ketogenic diet. It sounds really cool. I think maybe a Hollywood celebrity might be doing it. Is that better than plant-based? What do you think? And I guess I'm going to ask you if this is two ways. One is environmentally, one is health-wise. Keto, plant-based, what do you think?
There's a softball question if I've ever heard one. Of course, it depends. So all ketogenic diet means really extremely high-fat diet. So if you were just, chugging bottles of vegetable oil every day, environmentally, it might not be as impactful. But typically when people eat ketogenic diets, these extremely high-fat diets, they're eating animal products, meat, dairy, and eggs, which have, as we're learning today, some of the highest environmental impacts. And I think the thought that ketogenic diets are somehow more environmentally friendly might be from their eschewing some of the processed foods, but that's nothing compared to animal products. I mean, if I could touch on the question that Lois got, I looked into the Impossible and Beyond life cycle analyses that they commissioned from independent institutions. I have a bunch of videos on the environmental impacts of those on nutritionfacts.org. And indeed, so they got, these are legit institutes. Center for Sustainable Systems at the University of Michigan did the Beyond thing, 90% less greenhouse gas, 90% less land use, 99% less water, about half the energy used, about the same thing with Beyond. They used Qantas. And so these are just night and day differences, whether you're talking about animal-based meat or plant-based meat. But of course, beans are healthier, particularly from a human health standpoint. But I don't want to really kind of underestimate the great strides that are being made in the and plant-based meat and plant-based milk and plant-based egg space now, in terms of dramatically, like an order of magnitude, lower environmental impact.
Okay, so if I understand right, you're saying the ketogenic diet, not so good for the environment, plant-based diet, dramatically better, even, did I get this right? Even if it's not just some simple beans and vegetables and fruits, but even if it's what you might call a processed vegan food.
Even highly, in fact, technically, what Beyond Impossible makes, these are ultra-processed foods, right? Bearing very little resemblance to anything one might typically use in kind of a traditional culinary setting. Yet still, even though ultra-processed, even though all ingredients from all over the place, 90% less greenhouse gases than actually raising animals. You can imagine how animal agriculture is just a black box of inefficiency. You have all this feed, energy, protein going in, but these animals have to live and respire and move around and create skeletons and other inedible parts. And so what you actually get out at the end is just a small fraction of both the resources that go in and the nutrition that goes in. You get this mountain of nutrition going to these animals. You get a tiny amount out. You completely process out 100% of the fiber. We think something like white rice or white flour is processed because, much of the fiber is removed. How about taking those plants and removing 100% of the fiber by processing them through animals? Animal products are the truly ultra-processed foods in the supermarket.
because they're processed through a living factory. Okay, amazing. Let me bring up Dr. Duram. This is from Paula. Paula said, okay, this is an interesting question. Paula wants to know about soy. Can you talk about the environmental impact of soy?
Sure. I don't know why people like to hate on soy. Soy is not a problem, except that something like 80–85% of all soybeans we grow in the world are fed to animals. So yeah, there's a problem because we're tearing down rainforests. For example, you may have seen, I don't think it was in this lecture I gave today, but I have a nice map showing terrible destruction still to even recently in the Amazon rainforest, tearing down rainforests to plant soybeans for livestock feed. So yeah, if we just simply grew enough soybeans, I think it's something like 5 or 7% of soybeans that we grow right now are actually used for human consumption. So soy milk, tofu, tempeh. If we just grew soybeans for human consumption, not a problem. Beans are great. Soybeans, garbanzos, pintos, we love beans. We all need beans. The problem is that we're growing a lot of soybeans for livestock feed and for oils, a bit for biofuel. But really the main problem is overdoing it, producing too many soybeans so that we can feed them, again, as others have said, through an animal, a very inefficient process to get out a small amount of meat. So again, any sort of international policies to try and address climate change to keep us below that 2 degrees Celsius, we need big actions. We need big changes, and absolutely trying to reduce that soybean production that's going right to animals, right to livestock. That's going to be an important step.
Okay, so the problem with soybeans is that we're not eating them. The problem with soybeans is we're feeding them to chickens.
Exactly.
Okay, I got it. That's great. All right, thank you. Let me bring up Chef Lois. Chef Lois, I've got an interesting question here that I don't have a clue about, but you're going to know. This is from Lakshmi. She wants to move away from eggs, and she's looking for ways of making scrambles or, quote, omelets, something that's egg like an egg, but not an egg. What can Lakshmi do?
So that's an interesting question. When you do baking, you can make a flax egg, but that's not something you can do a scramble with. You can do a scramble with tofu, and I think tofu scrambles are really, really good. But one of my favorite things to do is to shift away from the traditional thought process of what an omelet is or a scrambled egg texturally and use other vegetables. So I love to use squash or sweet potatoes. They will start to get sort of soft, and some of my favorite things to add to that would be mushrooms or kale or green onions. And so when you think about a scramble, shift your brain to think that it's really about a saute. It's really about sauteing some of your favorite ingredients, what's going to bring out flavors, what's going to make you feel full, and just shifting texturally to think it's not going to be like an egg. It's going to be different, and it's going to be better. It's going to be more nutritious and more delicious. And as a chef, that's one of the biggest things that I like to do.
Okay. By the way, can you jump in on the question that was asked earlier about eating more locally? Because I know this has been something that you have given a lot of thought to.
Yeah, I love to be solution orientated, and I love to feel individually that I make a difference. And so some of the things that we can do as individuals is to plant an edible landscape. I know here in New Mexico, we just in my yard or land around, I looked and said, what was indigenous? I helped those indigenous plants. We have wolfberries, we have wild currants, we have pine nuts, we have wild spinach, we have a form of a wild amaranth. And then I planted foods that I knew would do well wildly. An edible landscape is what I called it. We have choke cherries. We have my favorite weed of all, purslane. And so, rather than using pesticides or chemicals, look at your land and look at what might have grown there ancestrally. And what can you do just in your little area to eat plants and what plants? Don't spray those dandelions. They're amazing. those dandelions have nutrition. They're delicious. And then buy local. We like to push buying native. Some of the small vendors, I know COVID has popped up these grandmas that are now selling culinary ash. And we can support them. We can support entire families doing what they've always done. And I think that's makes a big difference. I feel like I'm contributing to something much larger when I do that. I think it's really important.
Great, thank you, Lois. Let me bring up Emma Finn. Emma, we've got a question here that I think has your name on it. How can we get diet into the mainstream conversation about climate change? It seems like policymakers and environmental groups touch on everything else when it comes to the environment, but they don't touch on the diet. How can we change that?
It's a source of it's a source of frustration for me and my colleagues. I'll tell you that. I think it can get into the mainstream conversation when people talk about climate change to also start talking about what other people can do. You know, we talk about solutions, telling people to unplug their computers at night, turn off your monitors, you know, drive electric vehicles. I think, you know, changing conversations with our peers, but also in curriculum, right? With students, we start young. I took environmental studies starting in high school. You know, bring the diet into that conversation is so key. Bring textbooks in that kind of realm. So I think the way that we eat, the way that we produce our food, these are arguably the most important shifts we as an individual and in society need to do to combat climate change. So I also think it's about calling our representatives. The question, you know, kind of said how policymakers aren't really touching on this issue. At the state and federal levels, we need to demand that they address these issues. You know, a big thing about my team is why hasn't the Biden administration, you know, kind of put this forward as one of their focal points? You know, their Build Back Better plan doesn't do a lot of diet shifting or, you know, stuff at USDA Foods program that could really make huge shifts in the way that we spend our money at the government level and also nationally.
Okay, beautiful. Let's hope that happens because it's so long overdue. If you don't mind, I would like to bring up the whole panel. And I've got two questions for everybody. My first question is, are we getting anywhere? Are we making progress? There has been a plant-based movement for a long time, but, you know, going way back to Diet for a Small Planet, Francis Moore Lepay, people, and through John Robbins and others, we've been really pushing. So my question is, are we getting anywhere? And a related question, somebody chatted in the question, what if I do it one meal a day? Does that make a difference? Am I going to get anywhere with that? Let me start with Dr. Kong. A, are we getting anywhere? B, one meal a day. Does it help or not?
Yeah, I'll start with the second, which is obviously anything you can do to lessen or eliminate your meat consumption is going to help the environment. I did want to quote this one statistic the other day that said that in the U.S., if we skip one meat meal a week and substituted it with a vegan meal, it would be like taking 300,000 cars off the road. So yes, I think we're all moving in the right direction, but not fast enough. And I want everybody who's watched this summit today to realize the immense power you have as a consumer to continue driving the plant-based movement forward. It's all about bringing into mainstream awareness that we cannot address climate change without making a major transformation in our food systems, shifting to a new paradigm of health from the focus on treating illness to preventing disease from happening in the first place, reorienting away from a profit growth mindset to one of preserving life and our resources, taking on the role as a planetary caretaker. And then the last thing I want to say is that a part of this whole conversation is about deepening our most precious gift, that of compassion. It's not only about the physical, it's about what we're doing to these animals, because society as a whole has a huge blind spot where animals are concerned. Writer and activist Jim Mason calls it self-anesthetization. We've become so numbed to the exploitation of animals, which is the most violent and cruel act taking place on the planet today. So I call veganism a revolution of the heart to bring us all to a higher level of caring.
Fantastic. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Greger. Same questions. Are we getting anywhere? And what about one meal a day?
You know, anyone who asks, are we getting anywhere? I mean, I can imagine some young folks just starting into this movement, being frustrated by the rate of progress. But for those of us who've been doing this decades, it is just this remarkable explosion in progress in terms of the constellation of new consumer choices, like looking at the dairy case these days. And now you know why major dairy corporations are simply going out of business. But we don't need anecdote. We actually have data. The meat industry's big survey just came out on the 29th, so just a few days ago, found that compared to 2019, those who consider that in the U.S., those who self-label themselves as meat eaters dropped from 2019. In 2019, it was 85%, 71% in 2021. And similarly, flexitarianism, those who are trying to cut down on meat, grew from nearly double. 2019, it was 19. We went from 10% up to 2021, 19%. And I think that is a tremendous sign of progress. It's the people that are cutting down on these animal products that are making the biggest impact. So for not just one meal a day, even one major meal a week, these Meatless Monday programs can have tremendous impacts when instituted on an institutional level. So when the LA Unified School District instituted a Meatless Monday plan, you can imagine how many meals that is. Same thing happened in New York City. Some of the biggest school systems on the planet are offering as the default option the healthy option, both for the planet and for human health, not only from a chronic disease standpoint, like heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, but from a pandemic risk standpoint to protect us against future infectious disease threats.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Greger. Dr. Duram, same question to you. Are we getting anywhere?
Oh, that's such a great question. So I meet a lot of young people, right? I teach at a university. So I'm fairly optimistic. They always joke with me, well, you're a very optimistic person. But getting the word out, just having even the concept plant-based, people pretty much know what that means now, which, I went vegan like 10 years ago, vegetarian 20 some years ago, and people didn't even really know what that meant. So I'm optimistic that more younger, diverse people are understanding and taking action, and they're interested in these issues. Now, we definitely need national leadership, international climate change agreements to limit our greenhouse gas emissions. We absolutely need to take those actions, but we as individuals can take action to eat smart for the planet and vote smart for the planet so that we get leaders who will take those broader action. So in environmental studies, I'm very optimistic. I see students who are really, really interested in this. And I'm just hopeful that things like this, bringing together, I think that's the key, right? Bringing together issues of deforestation, bringing together issues of environmental injustice, bringing to health issues, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions. So the science, the social science, the people, the environment, we've got to bring this all together. We all need to work together, join forces, and push for change.
I love it. Chef Lois Ellen Frank, let me bring you back up. Are we getting anywhere? I know that you have taken really the long view in the studies that you have done. Tell me, are we making progress, or are we going in some other direction?
Oh, absolutely. We're totally making progress. And I think, as a chef, one of my biggest things is getting people to taste and to experiment with plants and to realize that as you start to taste how delicious you can make a plant-based meal and a plant-based soup and a plant-based dish. It's not only salads. There's so many dishes that you're not going to miss the meat, and we're going to convert you because plant-based is healthier. There's so much flavor, and I'm just a big advocate. My next cookbook is going to be completely plant-based. So as a chef, I'm moving into making these plants taste amazing and letting everybody taste them and realize how good they are.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Lois. Last, let me bring up Emma Finn. Let me get your perspective on this. Are we getting anywhere? Are we making progress? And also, do partial steps like one meal a day, does that help?
Yeah, thanks. I'd say yes and no. I'm cautiously optimistic. No, I am optimistic. I'm happily aware of the data trends showing how Americans increasingly want to eat more plant-based and plant-forward, reducing the amount of meat and dairy in their diet, and that people are starting to care more about where their food comes from. On the flip side, I am concerned by the large increase in retail sales that big industrial meat producers have scored during the pandemic. And I'm slightly concerned by some of the corporate takeover of plant-based protein alternatives, kind of dominating the social narrative about what it means to be on a plant-based diet. And as my colleagues on the panel mentioned, when the resources, the indigenous and traditional knowledge of eating whole plant-based proteins such as beans, legumes, tofu, and tempeh are available, better for our bodies and for the environment, I'd like to see more of that be uplifted in the conversation. And just to shoot out some numbers, so we run numbers around school district lunch menus, and we have seen how important one shift can make a difference. So, for example, our most recent report, the State of School Lunch in California, we show how if all school districts in California just swapped out a beef burger for a black bean burger 1 day per month, if it's a Friday, First Fridays or whatever, it would save 220 million pounds of CO2 equivalent in 1 year. That's the same as taking 22,000 cars off the road for a year, or the electricity for 26,000 residential solar systems for 1 year. In general, a cheeseburger we found was 15 times more carbon intensive than a plant-based offering on the school lunch menu. So yes, one meal does matter.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thanks to the whole panel. We enjoyed so much your presentations. Thank you for answering all these extra questions. So everyone who's participating, a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you. And this is all the time that we have today. And I want to say a huge thank you also to those of you who have been tuning in today to all these presentations. And if you like what you heard, and if you'd like to learn a lot more, and if you'd like to get involved in the process of change, let me ask you to join the Physicians Committee. At the Physicians Committee, we do a lot of work to educate people. We do important research studies. We're changing how research is done. We'd love to have you as part of the team. You'll see more information if you just go on the web to pcrm.org/join. And if you're thinking, okay, it's time for me to change my own diet, I have a tip for you that I'd like to invite you to take advantage of. It's called our 21-day vegan kickstart. On your iPhone, on your Android, just go to wherever you get apps, and you can download the 21-day vegan kickstart for free. Menus, recipes, cooking videos, it's all there for you. And on the web, if you'd like to have a look there, just type in 21daykickstart.org. That's 21daykickstart.org, and you'll get lots and lots and lots of information there. All right, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much again to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of the participants. Thank you to Donna and Laura behind the scenes for making everything come together. Thanks very much. And the conversation is to be continued. Thanks so much, everyone.